1923, a federal inspector walked onto a tobacco farm in rural Kentucky and watched a 14-year-old boy do something that would land a grown man in federal prison today. The boy did not think twice about it. His father had taught him. His grandfather had taught his father. The whole county knew the technique, and it fed 3 generations of that family through drought, depression, and 2 world wars. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody needed to. And then, one by one, the government, the insurance companies, and the liability lawyers showed up. Not because the skills stopped working, because they worked too well, and the wrong people were paying attention. Number 7 on this list was banned outright in 14 states by 1955. Number 3 produced results that modern agricultural scientists still cannot fully explain or replicate. And number 12, the one involving open fire and pressurized steam, killed more American farm women than any other domestic accident between 1890 and 1935. They kept doing it anyway, because the alternative was watching their children go hungry. These are not forgotten because they failed. They are forgotten because someone decided you were better off not knowing them. Before we go further, subscribe, because what you are about to learn was erased from American memory not by accident, but by design. Let us count down the 20 forgotten farm skills they stopped teaching because they were too dangerous. 20. Boiling lye from raw ash. Before the chemical industry decided that soap came in a cardboard box, every American farm produced its own from 2 ingredients that most people would not touch today without protective gloves. The first was potassium lye, leached directly from hardwood ash saved all winter in a wooden hopper outside the kitchen door. The farm wife poured rainwater slowly through that ash, and what dripped from the bottom was a caustic liquid strong enough to dissolve a chicken feather in under 60 seconds. Modern safety labels classify potassium lye as a severe chemical burn hazard. In 1910, it was a Tuesday afternoon task given to a 12-year-old girl. The danger was real. Lye splashed in the eyes caused permanent blindness. Lye on bare skin left chemical burns that took weeks to heal. A batch that was too concentrated ruined a soap and burned anyone who touched it before the mistake was discovered. The farm wife tested the strength by floating a fresh egg in the solution. If the egg sat with exactly a quarter-sized circle showing above the surface, the concentration was right. Too much showing in the lye would burn skin. Too little and the soap would never harden. She knew this not from a manual, but from 30 years of watching her own mother do it and from the one time as a child that she got it wrong and learned what lye felt like on an open hand. By 1940, commercial lye from the hardware store had replaced the ash hopper on most farms. By 1970, even commercial lye had become difficult to purchase as regulations tightened around its use in drug production. Today, food-grade lye is classified as a controlled substance in several states. The ash hopper rotted in the yard. The knowledge went with it. 19. Open kettle canning without a pressure seal. For the first 200 years of American farm life, women preserved food in glass jars using a method that modern food safety authorities now classify as a severe botulism risk. The open kettle method involved heating food to boiling in a large pot, ladling it directly into hot glass jars, and sealing them with a lid while everything was still hot, relying on the cooling contraction to create a vacuum seal without any further processing. It worked most of the time. When it did not, the failure was invisible. Botulinum toxin has no smell and no color. A jar sealed by open kettle canning could look perfect, smell perfect, and contain enough toxin to kill every person at a dinner table. Farm women knew this. They were not ignorant of the risk. They were making a calculation that modern Americans rarely have to make. A family that could not preserve its summer harvest did not eat in February. The alternative to risky canning was no canning at all, which was not an alternative at all. The USDA began formally warning against open kettle canning in the 1940s. By 1988, the agency recommended that every jar of low-acid vegetables be processed in a pressure canner at 15 pounds per square inch for a minimum of 25 minutes. The old method was not simply discouraged. It was declared unsafe and struck from every official publication. What was lost in that erasure was not just a technique. It was the accumulated sensory knowledge of 2 centuries of women who could read a seal, smell a lid, and know by the behavior of a jar whether it was safe or not. Knowledge built from watching 100 batches process and understanding what correct looked like versus what wrong looked like. That knowledge cannot be replaced by a pressure gauge. And it is gone. 18. Working a tobacco cure barn. In the tobacco belt from North Carolina through Kentucky and into Virginia, the cure barn was the most dangerous building on the farm and the most important. A tobacco cure barn was a tightly sealed log or plank structure packed floor to ceiling with green tobacco leaves hung on sticks from tiered poles. Underneath them, a network of iron flues ran from a furnace outside the building into the interior, circulating heat without open flame directly under the leaves. The farmer's job was to raise the temperature inside that sealed barn from ambient outdoor air to 165 degrees Fahrenheit over a period of 4 to 6 days without setting the building on fire. He did this by tending the furnace continuously, adjusting the draft, reading the color of the leaves through a small peephole, and never sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch for the entire cure. The danger was carbon monoxide from the flues and the very real possibility of the barn igniting. A barn fire during cure destroyed an entire year's income in under 15 minutes. The carbon monoxide danger was subtler and more consistently lethal. Farmers working inside cure barns to adjust leaf positions were found dead with no external marks. The cause was not understood until well into the 20th century. Before that, it was called bad air, and experienced farmers simply knew not to spend too long inside a barn that was running hot. Federal child labor regulations eventually banned children from cure barn work entirely. Insurance companies drove most small-scale tobacco farmers out of business between 1980 and 2010. The family cure barn, once the economic backbone of an entire American region, is now a historical artifact. Fewer than 3,000 active flue cure operations remain in the entire United States, and the number falls every year. 17. Slaking lime for whitewash. Before latex paint existed, American farm buildings were maintained with whitewash, a suspension of calcium hydroxide in water that killed bacteria, reflected light, and kept wood from rotting. The calcium hydroxide, called slaked lime, was produced on the farm by a process that generated temperatures high enough to cause severe burns and, if water was added incorrectly, a violent exothermic reaction that could spray scalding liquid across a wide area. The process started with quicklime, calcium oxide, purchased from a local kiln or made on the farm from limestone burned in a rock kiln. When water was added to quicklime, the reaction was immediate and violent. Steam rose in dense clouds, the material crackled and swelled. Temperatures reached 500 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface of the reaction. A man who leaned over the pit at the wrong moment walked away with burned lungs. A child who stumbled near a fresh lime pit did not walk away at all. Farm families who slaked their own lime did it outdoors, downwind, with everyone else kept well back. They added water in small amounts, slowly, to control the reaction. They learned the proper distance by watching their fathers and by understanding that the steam rising from a fresh lime pit was not steam in the ordinary sense but a caustic aerosol that damaged tissue on contact. The USDA Extension Services stopped recommending on-farm lime slaking in the 1950s. Pre-slaked hydrated lime in paper bags from the hardware store made the dangerous step unnecessary. Within a generation, nobody remembered how to do it anymore, which meant nobody remembered why it had to be done so carefully. 16. Rendering tallow in open iron kettles. Tallow, the rendered fat of cattle and sheep, was the petroleum of the 19th century American farm. It made candles, waterproof leather, greased axle hubs, seasoned cast iron, and served as a base for medicinal salves. Rendering it required maintaining a large iron kettle of animal fat at temperatures between 300 and 350 degrees Fahrenheit over an open outdoor fire for hours at a time. At those temperatures, a single drop of water introduced into the kettle from a wet utensil or a sudden rainstorm caused an instantaneous steam explosion that launched burning fat in every direction. The burns caused by boiling tallow were among the most severe injuries a farm could produce. Fat burns at those temperatures did not stop burning when the source was removed. They penetrated deep tissue and continued working for minutes after contact, long after the initial splash was over. Farm women who rendered tallow wore heavy wool garments rather than cotton or linen. Wool does not ignite as readily and does not melt into the skin the way synthetic or plant fiber fabrics do. They kept a bucket of dry sand, never water, within arm's reach for fire suppression. They worked in pairs when the weather was uncertain. They kept children at a distance that was enforced strictly and without explanation, because the explanation involved describing what happened to the ones who got too close. This knowledge was physical and spatial, carried in the body rather than in any written record. The distance you stood from a rendering kettle, the angle you held a ladle, the way you moved around an open fire without creating air currents that could shift the heat. These were things learned by proximity to someone who already knew them, and they vanished when the electric rendering plant and the commercial lark made on-farm tallow production unnecessary. 15. Dynamiting stumps and rock. From the 1870s through the 1940s, dynamite was a standard agricultural tool. It was used to clear stumps from newly broken ground, to shatter buried rock formations that blocked plowing, to break log jams on farm-adjacent streams, and in dry farming regions, to fracture hardpan subsoil that prevented water from penetrating deep enough to sustain crops through a dry summer. Farmers purchased dynamite and blasting caps from the general store or directly from mining supply companies by mail order. It was regulated in a general sense but accessible to any adult who could pay for it. The use of it on private agricultural land required no permit, no license, and no supervision. The danger was not primarily from the explosion itself, though mishandled dynamite produced catastrophic injuries and deaths every year. The primary danger was from freezing. Nitroglycerin-based dynamite became unstable when it froze and thawed repeatedly, a condition common in unheated farm storage through a Midwest or Appalachian winter. Thawed frozen dynamite sweated nitroglycerin onto its outer surface, becoming sensitive enough to detonate from a sharp impact or a dropped match. Farmers who stored dynamite in their root cellars alongside their winter vegetables and then forgot about it for a season were handling what amounted to a contact explosive by spring. The men who used it safely had a working knowledge of its chemistry, its behavior in cold, and the specific indicators: the oily surface sweating, the softened stick, the faint sharp smell, that told them a box had gone bad. Federal regulations progressively tightened between 1940 and 1980 until agricultural dynamite use became impractical for individual farm operations. The stump remains. The knowledge of how to remove it safely is gone from American farming memory entirely. 14. Arsenic-based insect control. Before synthetic pesticides arrived in the late 1940s, American farmers controlled insects with compounds that modern agricultural chemists classify as acutely toxic to humans and animals and that would trigger a federal environmental emergency if applied today in the quantities routinely used on pre-war farms. The primary compounds were lead arsenate, used heavily on apple orchards and potato fields from the 1890s through the 1940s, and Paris green, a copper acidoarsenite that was dusted onto cotton and tobacco. These were not emergency measures or last resorts. They were the standard tools of productive American agriculture for 50 years. Farmers who used them knew they were working with poisons. They wore bandanas over their mouths when dusting. They did not let children into fields that had been treated within the previous week. They washed their hands before eating and understood that the metallic taste in their mouths after a day of dusting was a sign to stop work and get fresh air. What they did not know, because the science did not yet exist to tell them, was that lead arsenate persisted in soil for decades. Orchards treated with lead arsenate in 1920 still show elevated arsenic levels in their soil today. A century later, the farmhands who mixed the compounds by hand, who filled dusting machines without respiratory protection, who washed arsenate-coated tools in the same stream where they drew drinking water, they accumulated doses that modern occupational medicine would recognize as chronic arsenic poisoning. They called it tired blood or summer sickness and kept working. The USDA phased out lead arsenate use between 1948 and 1966. DDT replaced it and was itself banned in 1972. The quiet, accumulated cost of a century of pre-regulatory agriculture in human health terms has never been fully calculated. 13. Reading and setting a bear trap. In the mountain farming regions of Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the northern Great Lakes states, the steel leghold bear trap was a practical agricultural tool well into the 20th century. Bears raided cornfields and apple orchards, killed hogs, and destroyed beehives. A single bear could wipe out a small farm's honey production in a night and return every night until driven off or killed. Setting a number 4 or number 5 bear trap, the sizes capable of holding a black bear, required placing a device under several hundred pounds of spring tension using a setting clamp and a foot lever, positioning it precisely in a natural travel path, concealing it under a thin layer of debris, and anchoring the chain to a drag log heavy enough to prevent the animal from carrying the trap into the woods but light enough for the bear to move, which tired it and prevented self-amputation of the leg. The danger was not complicated to understand. A number 5 trap closing on a human hand produced a crushing injury that required surgical amputation. It happened. It happened more than once to experienced trappers who were distracted for a moment, who set traps in failing light, who reached back for a trap they thought they had unloaded. Children on farming properties and trapping country were taught from the earliest age to recognize trap sets by subtle disturbances in the ground and to walk wide around anything that looked wrong in the woods. That education was specific and serious. Federal regulations on leghold traps vary by state and have progressively tightened since the 1970s. Most states with significant bear populations now require licensed trapping permits that involve formal safety training, the generational knowledge of trap mechanics, animal behavior, and set placement that once lived in every Appalachian farming family has been replaced by a licensing exam and a YouTube tutorial, which is not the same thing. 12. Pressure canning over wood fire. Before propane and electric stoves standardized heat output, American farm women ran pressure canners over wood fires. A pressure canner over wood fire is not a technically complex operation. It is an extremely dangerous one if the fire surges, the heat climbs, and the pressure relief valve fails to vent in time. The cast iron pressure canners of the 1910s and 1920s had simpler relief mechanisms than modern units. A rubber gasket, a weighted jiggle cap, and a petcock vent were the only barriers between a controlled 20-pound pressure environment and a container explosion that sent cast iron fragments and boiling liquid across a kitchen at lethal velocity. Farm women managed this risk through continuous attention and through the specific knowledge of their particular stove, their particular canner, and what normal operation looked, sounded, and smelled like. A stove that burned hot and fast required different management than a stove that ran slow and even. The jiggle of the pressure cap had a rhythm that an experienced canner could read the way a musician reads tempo. Too fast meant the heat was climbing and the fire needed banking. Silent meant the seal had failed and pressure was building without release. The women who blew up pressure canners were not careless. They were distracted, a child crying, a cow loose in the garden, a husband calling from the barn. At the moment when the stove needed tending, those distractions cost them their hands, their faces, sometimes their lives. County extension reports from the 1920s and 1930s document pressure canner explosions as a leading cause of severe kitchen burn injuries in rural households. The women kept using the canners because a burned hand healed. 11. Making saltpeter from barn floor compost. Saltpeter, potassium nitrate, was an essential preservative in American farm curing operations from the colonial period through the early 20th century. It kept cured ham and bacon pink, suppressed the anaerobic bacteria that caused botulism in salt-cured meat, and extended shelf life in a way that salt alone could not achieve. On farms that could not easily purchase saltpeter from a general store, it was extracted directly from the accumulated compost of a barn floor. The bacteria that decomposed animal waste in soil produced nitrates as a byproduct. Old barn floors rich in manure and straw, aged for years, contained measurable concentrations of potassium nitrate that could be leached out with water and processed into crystals through evaporation. The process was slow, imprecise, and produced material of variable concentration. A curer who used saltpeter of unknown strength in meat preservation was working with uncertain chemistry in a domain where the margin for error was narrow. Too little saltpeter failed to prevent botulism. The farm family that ate that ham in December had no way of knowing, from the appearance or smell of the meat, that the preservation had failed until they were already ill. The knowledge of how to read cured meat for safety, the color, the texture at the bone, the smell when a ham was probed with a thin knife, was the corrective against an imprecise process. Experienced curers trusted their senses because their senses have been educated over decades of watching meat either succeed or fail. That sensory education is gone. What remains is sodium nitrite in measured quantities from a commercial curing supplier, which is safer in the narrow sense while being entirely dependent on a supply chain that did not exist in 1890. 10. Working a horse-drawn hay stacker. Before mechanical balers, the loose hay stacker was a cable and pulley system pulled by a horse team to lift large loads of loose hay from the ground to the top of a growing stack. The operator walked beside the horse team, controlled the load, and managed the timing of the dump, which released the hay onto the stack from a height of 15 to 20 feet. The danger was in the cable. A frayed cable under load parted with enough energy to cut through a man's torso. The horse team, spooked by the snap of a broken cable or by a load shifting unexpectedly, could bolt and pull the entire stacker apparatus over onto anyone standing in the wrong position. The dump mechanism, if released prematurely while a man was on top of the stack positioning hay, sent him down with the load. Hay stacking operations ran a strict spatial protocol that everyone on the crew understood before the first load went up. Nobody stood inside the cable triangle while the team was pulling. Nobody climbed the stack while the stacker was in motion. The man on top of the stack signaled before the dump with a specific call that varied by farm but was always the same call, every time, so that the operator knew exactly when to trigger the release. That protocol existed because people had died from violating it. The specific memory of who died, how, and why was part of the safety culture of every crew that ran a stacker. When mechanical balers replaced loose hay operations in the late 1940s and 1950s, the stacker went to the back of the equipment shed and then to the scrap pile. The protocol went with it. 9. Processing pokeberries for ink and dye. Pokeweed grows on the edges of cleared land throughout the eastern half of the United States, and it is toxic at every stage of its maturity. The roots contain the highest concentration of phytolactotoxin, a compound that disrupts cellular division and causes severe gastrointestinal hemorrhage in sufficient doses. The berries contain enough toxin to kill a small child who eats a handful. Farm families in Appalachia and the Mid-Atlantic use pokeweed anyway, for two purposes that required handling large quantities of the most toxic parts of the plant. The first was ink production. Pokeberry juice, reduced by simmering and preserved with salt and vinegar, produced a deep magenta ink used for record keeping, correspondence, and marking livestock through the 18th and 19th centuries. Thomas Jefferson is documented to have used pokeberry ink for some of his correspondence. Civil War letters written in pokeberry ink survive in archives today. The second use was textile dyeing, where the berries produced colors ranging from pink to deep purple depending on modern chemistry. The skill was in the processing and the handling. Pokeberry ink makers who simmered berries in an indoor stove in an unventilated kitchen were absorbing toxins through their skin and through the steam. The farm women who did this routinely were not poisoned because they had learned, from the women before them, to work with the windows open, to avoid touching their faces during processing, to wash thoroughly before eating, and to keep the simmering time short. That protocol was not written down. It was taught by demonstration, by the admonition of a grandmother who had seen someone get it wrong, by the kind of embodied knowledge that lives in habit and dies with the last person who holds it. 8. Open Pit Lye Hominy. Before canned hominy and before commercial nixtamal operations, American farm families made their own by soaking dried corn in wood ash lye until the tough outer hull slipped free and the kernels swelled to nearly twice their original size. The chemistry involved, called nixtamalization, also released the niacin locked inside corn that is otherwise biologically unavailable to humans. Mountain communities that ate lye hominy did not get pellagra. Communities that ate plain cornmeal sometimes did. The open pit version of this process used large cast iron kettles suspended over an outdoor fire, with wood ash lye of uncertain concentration and no reliable method of measuring the pH of the solution. Corn soaked in lye that was too strong did not stop absorbing caustic material when the cook thought it was done. Improperly rinsed hominy, served to a family, delivered active lye to every person at the table. The skill was in the rinsing. Experienced hominy makers rinsed the corn a minimum of 7 times in cold spring water before it was considered ready to cook, and they tasted carefully at each rinse, knowing what improperly neutralized hominy tasted like versus clean hominy. The tongue could detect alkalinity at concentrations that were not yet physiologically dangerous. That sensory test was the safety check, and it was the only one. Federal food safety agencies do not recommend home lye hominy production today. The USDA Extension Service discontinued its lye hominy processing guidelines in the 1970s. A small revival exists among homesteaders using food-grade lye in measured quantities, which is a genuinely safer process. But the old way, the open pit way, with ash lye leached by hand and concentration judged by tongue, that specific knowledge belongs to almost nobody alive now. 7. Running a copper pot still. Before Prohibition, and in the culture of Appalachian and Scots-Irish farming communities that regarded whiskey production as an ancestral right predating the Republic itself, the copper pot still was a farm tool as ordinary as a churn or a smokehouse. The skill of running a still safely was genuine engineering knowledge. Copper was the preferred material not from tradition but because copper binds with sulfur compounds in the fermenting mash and removes them from the finished spirit, producing a cleaner product with fewer toxic congeners than stainless steel or inferior metals. The men who built their own stills hammered the copper by hand, formed the cone over a wooden mandrel, and soldered the seams with lead-free tin, knowing that lead contamination in the spirit would accumulate in the kidneys of anyone who drank it regularly. The safety knowledge was in the cut. The first liquid to come off a still, called the foreshots, contained elevated concentrations of methanol and acetaldehyde, compounds that at sufficient doses caused blindness and liver failure. An experienced distiller cut the foreshots by taste and smell before they entered the collection vessel, identifying the moment when the methanol-heavy first run gave way to the ethanol-dominant heart of the distillation. He knew this not from chemistry but from decades of making the same cut at the same moment, guided by a faint chemical smell and a slightly different mouthfeel. When federal enforcement shut down family distilling operations across Appalachia through the 20th century, the safety knowledge embedded in the practice, specifically, the skill of recognizing and separating toxic fractions from safe ones, went with it. Modern craft distillers learned this from textbooks and electronic sensors. The men who learned it from their fathers learned something different, which is not necessarily inferior. 6. Cold smoking meat below freezing. The smokehouse was a temperature-sensitive operation at every stage, and the most dangerous single condition a farm curer could encounter was an unexpected warm spell during a cold smoke run. Cold smoking, the technique of exposing cured meat to smoke at temperatures between 70 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit over a period of weeks, required consistent low temperatures to prevent the meat from entering the temperature range where bacterial growth accelerated. A November cold smoke operation in the Mid-Atlantic or Appalachian region ran through ambient temperatures that could drop to 20 degrees Fahrenheit overnight and climb to 55 in the afternoon within the same week. The smokehouse that was running at 85 degrees at midnight might be sitting at 110 degrees the following afternoon if the weather shifted and the operator did not adjust the fire accordingly. Meat that cycled through the bacterial growth range repeatedly during a cold smoke run did not always show visible signs of spoilage. The outer surface, coated with smoke deposits carrying antimicrobial phenolic compounds, could remain firm and good-smelling while the interior, particularly the tissue near the bone where temperature equilibration lagged behind the surface, had experienced enough warmth to allow bacterial growth. The skill of reading a ham at the bone, probing the joint with a thin steel skewer and smelling the metal after withdrawal, was the critical safety check that experienced curers performed before any cold smoked product was released for consumption. A ham that passed the bone test was safe. A ham that failed it was buried, not composted, because the failure meant something potentially capable of causing botulism and that material needed to be removed from the food chain entirely. That specific sensory knowledge, what good smells like at the bone of a year-old ham, and what wrong smells like, exists in perhaps a few hundred people in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia today. When they are gone, it is gone. 5. Working with Quicklime as a livestock disinfectant. Before antibiotic treatment became standard in American livestock management, Quicklime was the primary tool for disinfecting barns after disease outbreaks, treating hoof rot in cattle and sheep, and managing parasite loads in soil. Quicklime in contact with wet ground or wet livestock produced a violent exothermic reaction. A barn floor treated with dry quicklime that was then exposed to rain through a leaking roof generated temperature sufficient to ignite straw bedding. A cow that stood in a quicklime-treated pen before the material had fully carbonated developed chemical burns on the hoof and lower leg. The men who worked with agricultural quicklime knew its behavior in wet conditions because they had been taught its behavior in wet conditions. The teaching was specific. Quicklime goes on dry ground in dry weather, spreads thin, left to work for 2 days before any animal contact. Deviation from that protocol produced injuries. The protocol was not written on the bag. It lived in the knowledge passed between the men who used the material. Agricultural quicklime use has largely been replaced by hydrated lime and antibiotic treatments. The specific body of knowledge around quicklime management in agricultural settings is no longer transmitted because there is no longer a practical reason to transmit it. It is one of the many safety protocols that became unnecessary before anyone thought to write it down. 4. Wet hay fire prevention. A hay barn fire in July killed more American farm families than almost any other agricultural accident through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The cause in most cases was not lightning or careless smoking. It was spontaneous combustion from improperly cured hay packed too wet into an enclosed space. When hay is cut at more than 20% moisture content and packed tightly, the bacterial decomposition of the residual plant sugars generates heat. If the moisture content is high enough and the stack is large enough, the internal temperature rises past 150 degrees Fahrenheit, past the kindling point of dry hay in the outer layers, and the barn ignites from the inside out. The fire is invisible until it has been burning for hours inside the stack. Experienced hay farmers prevented this with a technique as simple as it was precise. They drove a steel rod, 6 feet long, into the center of a newly filled mow and left it there for 24 hours. When they pulled it out, they held the base of the rod against the inside of their wrist. Hot meant the hay was running too wet. Cool meant the cure was proceeding safely. That single rod test, performed by a man who understood what dangerous heat felt like against his wrist, prevented an incalculable number of barn fires over 2 centuries of American hay farming. It is essentially unknown today. 3. Controlled burning for soil and pasture management. Before synthetic fertilizers and herbicides, the most powerful tool in the American farmer's land management arsenal was fire. Controlled burning of fallow fields, brush encroached pastures, and woodland understory was practiced systematically across every agricultural region in the country. Get the four variables wrong: moisture content, wind speed and direction, relative humidity, fire break condition, and a controlled burn became a wildfire. The specific knowledge was in the firebreak construction and in the moment of ignition. A firebreak that was wide enough to stop a ground fire in wet conditions would not stop a crown fire in a dry one. The farmer who burned in conditions that risked crown fire and adjacent timber was making a decision that could destroy his own equipment and his neighbor's property simultaneously. The men who burned regularly knew what crown fire weather felt like: the specific combination of low humidity, elevated temperature, and wind that made smoke travel horizontally instead of rising, and that meant a fire set would run until it hit something that stopped it. That specific meteorological literacy, built from years of watching fire behavior in one particular landscape, is now held by professional fire management agencies with aircraft support and radio communication. It is not held by individual farmers. The Environmental Protection Agency and state forestry agencies have progressively restricted agricultural burning in most regions since the 1980s, citing air quality concerns that are scientifically legitimate and practical consequences that have removed a management tool from American farming without fully replacing its function. 2. Slaughtering large animals alone. Before veterinary regulations required licensed involvement in commercial livestock processing, and before the Federal Humane Methods of Slaughter Act of 1958 established standards for commercial facilities, the single-family slaughter of large animals was a skill that every serious farm operator needed to possess, and that most of them possessed in full. The danger in large animal slaughter, specifically cattle and draft horses, was in the stun and the bleed. A 500-pound hog improperly stunned regained consciousness during bleeding, which produced an animal in pain and capable of lethal defensive behavior in an enclosed space. A 1,000-pound steer improperly stunned could injure or kill everyone in a confined killing space before anyone could respond. A draft horse, familiar with the humans around it and placid under normal conditions, became extraordinarily dangerous in the brief window between an inadequate stun and complete loss of consciousness. The men who slaughtered alone had specific techniques for each species, each animal type, and each set of physical conditions. The placement of the captive bolt, the angle of approach, the positioning of the animal before the stun, the immediate management of the bleed to prevent the animal from rising. These were not general principles. They were specific technical knowledge applied to specific animals in specific contexts. The 1958 Federal Act removed most commercial large animal slaughter from farm settings. USD regulations progressively required that meat intended for sale pass through licensed processing facilities. The family slaughter of animals for personal consumption remains legal in most states, but the practical transmission of the skill has largely ended. What exists now is a combination of online resources, a small revival among homesteaders, and a handful of elderly farmers who learned it before the regulatory shift and have not found anyone younger willing to learn it from them. 1. Managing a farm through a complete year on no outside input. This was not a single dangerous skill. It was the combination of every dangerous skill on this list, operating simultaneously, managed by people with no safety net, no emergency services within practical reach, and no option to stop when conditions became difficult. In 1910, the average American farm family operated at 90% self-sufficiency. Every chemical they handled was something they had made themselves from raw materials they had produced on the property. Every food preservation process they ran was something they had learned from observation and repetition, not from a manual or a certification course. Every dangerous task they performed was one they had watched someone else perform, correctly and incorrectly, and had learned from both outcomes. The safety record of that system was not perfect. People died, children were burned and maimed, men were crushed by machinery and animals and falling timber. The farms that persisted across generations were the ones where the knowledge was transmitted accurately and the protocols were respected even when they were inconvenient, especially when they were inconvenient. What was lost when the chemical industry, the food safety regulatory apparatus, and the insurance liability system made these skills obsolete was not just the skills themselves. It was the culture of practical intelligence that surrounded them. The habit of understanding what you were doing and why, of reading physical materials by sight and smell and touch rather than by label, of knowing the failure modes of every process you ran and having a response prepared before the failure occurred. Modern America is safer from the specific hazards that killed 19th century farmers. It is profoundly more vulnerable to the general condition of not knowing how things work, where they come from, or what to do when the systems that provide them stop working. The knowledge was dangerous. The ignorance that replaced it is more dangerous, in ways that are harder to see until the moment when they are not. Here is the challenge. You do not need to run a still or slake lime or set a bear trap, but learn one physical process this year that requires you to read materials with your own senses rather than with a gauge or a label. Make a fire without a lighter. Preserve something without a recipe. Build something without instructions. Practice the intelligence your great-grandfather used every day before breakfast and treated as the bare minimum a man needed to know. Then tell me in the comments what you made and what you learned from the first time you got it wrong. Because getting it wrong, understanding why, and correcting it was how 150 years of American farmers stayed alive and kept their families fed. We stopped teaching that process the moment we decided the outcomes mattered more than the understanding. We have been paying for that trade ever since.